Have you ever wondered why that particular patient or client that you're working with just can't seem to squat well? You have given them mobility, breathing, and corrective exercises, but continue to fall short on their ability to squat with correct form. Well, the ultimate reason behind this is because they are just simply following their structure. The structure of the rib cage and the pelvis are ultimately what will dictate your patient or client's ability to squat. Functionally, what this means is that some of us are biased towards moving well vertically, while some of us are biased towards moving well horizontally. In the exercise world, that translates into squatters and deadlifters. So if that's difficult to understand, let me give you a little bit of a different analogy. If you think about a Lamborghini and a smart car, when you hear those two different cars, it creates expectations. You most likely assume that the Lamborghini goes fast, is expensive, and is bad on gas. Conversely, a smart car. That smart car is good on gas, not so fast, and inexpensive. Both of them have expectations, and you subconsciously created those based off its structure, its wheels, its engine, all the things that make the actual car. That is the same exact thing with the human body. So in this video, we're going to talk about why structurally your patient or client struggles to squat and how we can get them to improve their squat and really improve their whole movement variability so they can keep on moving well and pain-free. So to understand why your patient or client structurally struggles with a squat, we need to look at the foundation of the human body. Now, if you really want to dive deeper and understand the why and the how, I would suggest the online Performance Redefined course where we have 8 modules going over this exact content. But for this video's purpose, I want you to understand the general concepts so that you can start to implement them and put them into use in your practice. So when it comes to the foundation of the human body, we're looking at the rib cage, the spine, and the pelvis. And there's going to be a general theme and a general rule you can follow. Now, it's not always bulletproof, but for most of the time, and the majority of the time, this rule will apply. And that is the ones that have a hard time squatting are usually going to be ones that are in an extension-based pattern. So we're going to have extension at the spine. We're going to have a rib cage that is flaring up. We're going to have a rib cage that creates an angle of greater than 90 degrees at this infrasternal angle. And then we're going to have a pelvis that is in more of an anterior pelvic tilt. So let's zoom in on the pelvis and really understand how the anterior pelvic tilt creates a structural disadvantage for a squat. So with an anterior pelvic tilt, we have nutation occurring at the sacrum. Now, that's great, but what does that really mean for you functionally and clinically? Well, here's what I want you to take away. When you have nutation, you have the sacrum tipping anteriorly. That creates compression on the anterior side and expansion or length or eccentric orientation, however you want to think of it, on the back side. So when we go to move, in a squat, it should be very vertical. So if we don't have that compression, that constraint to move vertical, we're just going to follow where we have space. So in this anterior pelvic orientation, we have compression in the front and space in the back. So how do you think the trajectory of the pelvis is going to be? Well, it's going to be more in this horizontal because it's met with compression here. So the body doesn't want to go against it. It just goes where the path of least resistance is or where there's the available range of motion. So before we can give any sort of corrective and mobility exercises, we first need to gain compression where there's expansion and gain expansion where there's compression. Now, what does that really mean? That means that we need to provide our patient that cannot squat well with exercises that's going to bias compression here. That compression here is going to lead to expansion anteriorly, but really what that means is it's going to allow the normal trajectory of a squat. A squat should be very vertical-like, and the only way you can do that is if it's met with compression. If it's not, the squat just turns to a hinge. So this is why it's really important to understand the biomechanics of the pelvis so that you can provide your patient and client the strategies to get them in a good position first and then start to build strength on that good position. The first exercise we want to do is a reaching in a hook lying position. The main intent of this is to recapture and reposition the thorax and the pelvis. We already discussed that the main problem is that the structure and the pattern that this individual is in extension and an anterior pelvic tilt. So we want to work on first driving a position where the rib cage can come down, the pelvis can find more of a neutral position and get out of that extreme lumbar lordosis, and then doing so with a balloon. And that balloon really adds resistance for the abs so that we can bring the rib cage down and back and establish a better position before moving to more challenging exercises. The second exercise is a 90-90 hamstring bridge. The intent of this is to recapture posterior compression. Remember, we need enough posterior compression to move in a vertical trajectory. So the 90-90 hamstring bridge is a great way to start to reintroduce compression at the hamstrings while going through a hip extended position. The third exercise is a goblet slant board squat. Now we are intentionally putting them in a goblet position on top of a slant board with a heels elevated position. Let's start at the slant board. So the slant board with a heels elevated position is going to bias plantar flexion. And plantar flexion is associated with external rotation. So again, what does this mean for you functionally and clinically? It means that when you're in a heels elevated position, you are going to bias external rotation throughout the entire system. This external rotation is going to also come with posterior compression. So it's going to provide a secondary resource to help and aid your patient or client achieve that compressed posterior pelvis. Secondly, we are going in a goblet position because that anterior hold is really going to work on allowing to recapture that posterior orientation of the rib cage. And this is going to help bring the rib cage back, which is part of the problem, but that's also going to help to promote that compression at the posterior pelvis. So I hope you found that video valuable. Let's go over some of the main ideas. The next time you are working with a patient or client that is struggling with their squat, I want you to stop and reconsider your intervention. Maybe corrective exercise after corrective exercise isn't the best way about it. Instead, start to understand what is the structure dictating for that patient or client. Are they in an extension and an anterior pelvic tilt bias, which is going to contribute to a horizontal trajectory? If so, we want to find ways that can get them a little bit more posterior compression, a little bit more of a posterior pelvic tilt orientation, so that we can then start to move in a more vertical fashion, which is exactly what the squat requires.